I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop so I can come down to you? These are the words of Nehemiah as he built the walls fortifying Jerusalem over 2,000 years ago, as told in the book of Nehemiah in the Bible. Today we see, just as it was back then, that Jerusalem is the source of heavy conflict in the Middle East, with multiple groups of people vying for control over the ancient city, and global powers weighing in on the conflicts that have been brewing over centuries. Join us as we delve into the mystifying history of Jerusalem and Israel, exploring the ongoing struggles and complexities that have shaped this ancient area for over 2,000 years. Through riveting discussions, we unravel the mysteries surrounding Israel's pivotal role in global affairs, its significance in the Abrahamic faiths, and the intricate web of U.S. foreign policy in the broader Middle East. Get ready to expand your understanding of one of the most misunderstood regions on Earth, here on the Great Work Podcast. All right, welcome back to the Great Work Podcast. This week we have something a little different, someone we have not had on before, to talk about a topic that we haven't discussed really that much on this podcast since the 5th episode with Michael Pregent. We have not really talked about like domestic terrorism or homegrown terrorism, anything of that sort. And today we have on Selena Syrup. They are a former Antifa protester who was actually approached to sympathize with and potentially join Hezbollah. So I met Selena in a TikTok like space. I don't remember, or a live. I don't remember quite where, but I was fascinated by their stories, being involved with that sort of movement. And I just was like, oh my God, we need to talk about this. Like, we have someone who was on the inside. Now, Selena, after October 7th, kind of came around to the, they didn't really take a position on the issue of Israel-Palestine, but they felt that they were constantly told they needed to show their worthiness in the protest community um by sympathizing with these like Palestinian terror groups. And after October 7th kind of came down hardcore, it was like, well, no, if I'm indigenous and if Israelis are if Jews are indigenous to that region, why would they be denied a right to that land? So, really fascinating stuff. Again, something we haven't done here before, but I think you guys are really going to enjoy this episode. So thank you again to Selena for doing this. And without further ado, let's get into it. Selena, do you want to give a little bit about your background and introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Selena Syrup. I use they, them pronouns. I was a protester here in the Pacific Northwest. I basically did all the big protests, the Black Lives Matter protests. I did Justice for Patrick Kimmons. I did the ICE protests. I even helped organize some of those at some point. Um, and I did protesting for homeless sweeps in different areas, including Cal Anderson, Washington.
Awesome. And how did you get involved in this community?
So I dated people that were communist,
Okay.
and their friends ended up inviting me to these online communities. And so basically, I would have different opinions than other people. And eventually we would get into it, and they would tell me, you don't really get to have an opinion unless you have physically been to these protests and you're doing like what they would call boots on the ground work. And so I started having to go in person just to kind of see what it was like. I very quickly ended up getting involved with these different streamer organizations. So I first came into it as a person that was just trying to cover the protests, and I ended up leaving a protester.
Wow. Okay. Um, so kind of just involvement with like, left-wing activism, and then that's how you got brought into the fold. Would you consider your political or like social, cultural beliefs, like where would you put yourself on a spectrum?
I would say that I'm still left leaning, but I'm
Mhm.
independent.
Okay.
Um, I no longer consider myself to be what they would say is Antifa. I no longer use that label for myself. Um,
Yeah.
I mostly just, when people ask me, what are your politics? I tell them they're indigenous.
Okay. Because you're indigenous. So that's kind of where your political focus is.
Yes, I am Raramuri and I'm also Yaqui.
Awesome. Okay, cool. So I think that's interesting, especially so I had my own kind of run in with Antifa when I was in college. Long story short, I was involved with like right wing campus activism at a different school, but I was like the chair of my state. And one of my chapters, basically all of the clubs at this school get to paint three like bridge panels, I guess, on this bridge that connects the east and west camp or east and west side of the campus over a river. And so they painted these three bridge panels and they said, normal Republican things for 2016. But it said like college Republicans, Trump, Pence, and then one of them said build the wall. And Antifa doxed my friend, her phone number, her parents' phone number, her on campus address, her phone number, and it was like a really big problem. Like she had to get a police officer involved and stuff. So I know the bad parts of that organization, so I'm glad you're out of it for like the bad part.
Yeah, I would say that I disagree with having a wall of,
Yeah.
well, I disagree with like the rhetoric behind the wall. I don't disagree with having borders entirely.
Yeah.
But yeah, we definitely had a toxic culture of doxing people to the point where at times people were getting doxed for things that were like not even that serious. Um, like people were getting doxed for like misspeaking. People were getting doxed for things that they had done years ago that, when they had like since changed their opinion. People were finding reasons to dox people because after a while they got a taste for it and it became just kind of senseless fun.
Yeah.
People get a
Yeah.
high off of it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and it's hard, like, yeah. It's hard when you have like a not even 21-year-old girl, like, run like on campus, like now all of a sudden like scared to go to class because like they
Or even
tweeted
like
that. Yeah.
or
Sorry.
even scared to go home.
Right. Right. Well, scared to go to class and like leave your home because who's going to be outside, and then scared to go home because who's going to come.
Yeah,
Um,
it got very personal. People got very personal.
yeah, definitely. So, okay. So a couple things with like the protest community and protest culture, because well, a point I want to make is like the whole notion of getting involved in these, like they're all just causes, getting involved in this, right? Like it's a just cause. When you hear the term Black Lives Matter, who is going to disagree with that, right? Like obviously Black Lives Matter, who's not going to want to support that and get involved with that? I see it almost as a parallel, and I want to be sensitive to this, but like I want to draw the comparison of this is how a lot of groups in the Middle East start. A lot of the groups that we know as terrorist groups, the names translated in Arabic, like Hezbollah, for instance, means party of God. Who over there is going to say, well, I disagree with the party of God, right? But then what
Right.
ends up happening and what it sounds like you're talking about is there are some behaviors that become a little bit um problematic or that you disagree with, and
Yeah.
you yeah, and then it's like, okay, well, I agree with the sentiment, right? But like I don't really agree with that. So like do you want to talk about you've told me some stories, but do you want to talk about some of the behaviors that you observe that maybe made you uncomfortable, and then also talk about like what differentiates your protest style, I guess?
Um, yeah, I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to say on here on your platform, but for
You can say whatever you
example,
want. Yeah.
awesome. So, for example, we had people that started bringing firearms, and so
Mhm.
everybody was bringing firearms on both sides. And at some point, um, somebody ended up getting shot, and then that
Oh,
person ended up getting killed by the police. And so there's
wow.
different opinions on, who was right, who shot first, who shot second. But ultimately, the thing that the point at which I didn't agree with anybody was people were saying like, well, good for that guy, he should have died. He should have gotten shot in like this little street duel. Um, and to me,
Oh,
I'm just like, nobody wants that to happen, but you people are actively cheering for like the actual death of people you disagree with now. And
mhm.
I'm really more of a Cesar Chavez person, where like if the other side wants to kill me, then I I would feel better just having died like a righteous death.
Yeah. Wow. That's intense.
Yeah, yeah, we
Yeah.
had people celebrating that.
Yeah. So, okay, because I mentioned this to you before we like when we initially connected, but I'm a sometimes listener to Tim Pool, who has like kind of a large media conglomerate now, based in West Virginia, but he was a Vice reporter, I believe, for like Ukraine stuff back in the like early 2010s, and then also during the Occupy protests. And he was like an actual protester himself. I think he was covering it for Vice, but I think he was also like there because he believed in the cause and stuff. And he was saying what made him uncomfortable was there was some phrase, and I might be paraphrasing, where he said, like, you're not allowed to question other people's forms of resistance. So, like, basically, if you're peacefully protesting, holding up a sign, totally fine. But if you see the people part of your same movement go and, let's say, start a fire or break into a shop and loot it or something like that, you're not allowed to question them because that's their form of resistance. Like, did you experience that at all?
My line is actually like a little bit further than that. Like, I
Okay.
don't really care about destruction of property. I'm
Hmm.
more concerned about whether or not people are getting hurt.
Yeah.
And people were absolutely advocating for that. And that was the point at which I was like, well, now you're just having like gangs of New York style fights with people where like people are going to come out with the cleavers. And I definitely disagree with that. I also had people that came up to me and wanted me to read specific literature. Um,
Hmm.
and I was basically like, no, thank you. I
What
had
was the
somebody wanted me to read Chairman Mao's Red Book as well as Gaddafi's Green Book. And when it comes to people like that, like, Che Guevara, all these different leaders, Karl Marx, I feel like I don't admire any of them specifically. I
literature?
agree with maybe like a few quotes here and there that each one might have had.
Hmm.
I'm sure I could find three quotes from Chairman Mao that I agree with. Do I worship him and want to read an entire book of his quotations? Absolutely not. It's a waste of my time,
Hmm.
um, because I don't believe in figureheads.
Okay.
Um, so it might be helpful to differentiate between like the anarchist side and the communist side,
Yeah,
where
definitely.
communists have a tendency towards figureheads, and so part of that, part of my aversion was that I dislike figureheads. But then
Mhm.
when you throw a book like Gaddafi's Green Book at me, and you want me to take him seriously as a political leader, and not as a dictator,
Mhm.
then you've got the wrong person. Um, I also had people that wanted me to take a look at the war over in Syria, and people were advocating for Hezbollah as a resistance group. And, the last thing that I want is for any of my struggles to be tied into like actual terrorism, because that's what the news is saying. The news is saying these people are all terrorists. And
Mm.
so why would I give them what they want?
Yeah. Well, okay, a lot there. First of all, what is the red book and green book for people who might not be familiar?
So the red book is a list of Chairman Mao quotations, and the green book is a list of quotations by Gaddafi.
Okay. And they want you to read that just to like be a show of loyalty or something?
Yeah, they felt that they felt that the position I had personally arrived to was not intense enough. And so they needed to turn up the communist in me. And I'm good.
Okay, right.
Um,
Okay, because I remember you saying something like this, where like you felt like people would get there and try and like outdo each other with the protesting sometimes. Am I?
Absolutely. And
Yeah.
it got to the point where I even had people sharing Taliban sniper porn with me, where they wanted me to cheer the death of US soldiers. And so I'm very anti war. I protested the war in Iraq when I was like a little kid.
Hmm.
I would like cut class to go do it. And, uh, the last thing that I would do is celebrate someone's actual death because that was part of my problem with it initially was like a lot of kids are dying. And so yeah, I they were asking me to like wish death on my enemies and like that's I'm in the Native American church. That's really not my style.
Yeah. Well, it's just like not okay to make people think that they need to cross an ethical boundary in order to support a cause, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, does this kind of so being recruited for Hezbollah, that I mean that is another level. But
Yeah.
yeah.
It I became extremely paranoid when that happened to me.
Mhm.
Because in these circles, the biggest fear anyone has is like I don't know if you're familiar with COINTELPRO.
Yes.
And
But
so
explain it for those who aren't.
COINTELPRO was the operation that took place from the FBI that eventually shut down the Black Panthers. And so everybody's biggest fear is that you never know where COINTELPRO could be. And so I thought that that was it. When someone came up to me and said, you need to support Hezbollah or you're not for oppressed people, I was like, if I was the government trying to break this movement down, I would definitely be coming in here trying to find those people.
Oh wow. So it's like, do you think it's a fair assessment to say that a lot of the people involved in that community may be kind of paranoid?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. People's paranoia was just off the charts. Um, People were doing like basically petty criminal mischief, um, vandalism, and so I think for a lot of these people, it was perhaps their first time committing vandalism, and so they're not aware that like the first couple times they kind of let you go. Uh, and so people thought that they were like gonna go to prison for life because they spray painted something on a building over some plywood, not even like the actual building. It's like the plywood that they put protectively over the glass that they can just primer very easily the next day. People thought that they were going to go away and do some hard time for that because they thought, I'm going to get put on a list. The FBI is going to watch me for the rest of my life. They're going to follow me.
I mean, to be fair, the FBI is kind of like secretive about kind of stuff like that. I mean, when I go back to the same doxing story, my friend that was doxed, she was on some sort of list for years where every single time she went through airport security, which was often because she flew a lot, she would be flagged for the random check. And without giving too much away from her, I mean, she's like a petite blonde girl. Like you probably wouldn't think that she would be racially profiled, right?
That's
Not that
right.
I'm condoning racial profiling at all because I don't, but that's not typically the person that would be flagged, right? Every single time she flew, which would be multiple times a month, she would be flagged. And then she ended up asking someone who worked at the White House, like, am I on a list? And then she was taken off that list and never was randomly flagged every time she flew again. So, like, there are some secretive mechanisms, and I understand why people are paranoid about them because that's one of my criticisms of the government is like things like that happen and like if you don't have a friend who works in like a low level job in the White House, how do you get yourself off that list?
I've only really heard of like one person that got on a list potentially, and she might have just been gassing herself up to make herself sound or make themselves sound like they were more important than they actually were. Um,
Oh yeah.
So there was one popular, like, anti-fascist, um, like, tweeter.
Okay.
Uh, well, she calls herself a journalist. She does a lot of tweets, and so a lot of those tweets are quite inflammatory, and they're explicitly in support of Hamas. And so at some point, she went through the airport and got the check, and so she decided to tell people that it was because of racial profiling.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it might have more to do with being extremely vocally in support of a terrorist organization on the internet where everybody can see.
Yeah, probably that. But, you know, who knows? Who knows, right? I mean, this brings me to, so like, would you say that there was like on average in the group, think, would you, I mean, I know that there's no way to like measure this, but would you say like 50% of people might have been sympathetic towards terrorist groups, like what we would determine as a terrorist group, like Hamas, Hezbollah?
Yeah,
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 50%.
there were.
Okay.
So there were a lot of people that were new that were just like, "Oh my God, I saw this horrible thing on the news, and I need to do something about it."
Hmm.
And then there was another group of people that were actively like using the word radicalized and using it proudly. They would come up to you and they would say, "When did you get radicalized?" As if it was like a baptism date. Like, yeah, it was kind of uncomfortable, and pretty corny, if you ask me.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. You know, that's funny. That was an Andrew Breitbart quote. Andrew
really?
Breitbart, yeah, Andrew Breitbart, who, if people don't know, or if you don't know, I mean, he was the founder of Breitbart, the conservative news network. He would go ask people, like, when were you radicalized, but like for the conservative cause, and it would be kind of like in jest. So that's funny
Oh
that
no,
it was, yeah,
they
this
take
was
it serious. Yeah, they absolutely take it seriously. Um,
on.
to me, I was like, when people would ask me that question, I was like, well, I didn't become radicalized. I was born an indigenous person, and so like we are raised with the concept of like getting our land back.
Hmm.
So for me, it was uncomfortable and like not to be a cliche, but to me, it sounded like a privileged question for people to ask me because they're basically like, I've been living in the shadows this whole time. What made you decide to start doing something about it? Or when did you start thinking about the problems in the world?
Oh, that's a really interesting way of thinking about that.
Yeah, it was really awkward. Um, I would say that yeah, it was maybe like 30% of people that were being proudly stating that they were radical, and the rest of them were either just like casually there, um, like they might be there on their day off, or
Uh-huh.
they were in the process of conversion because believe me, it was very religious and cult-like, I would say.
Oh, wow. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so first of all, not to like hate on anybody's lifestyle, but for example, there was a lot of like polyamorous behavior, and I'm okay with people doing that, but I had a lot of pressure to become polyamorous myself from the community. People would, like come up to me and try to date me, and then they would try to get me to date all their partners as well. When I'm like, you
Oh,
haven't even sold me on the individual yet.
right. That's kind of important. Oh,
Yeah, so they were like, I would consider that cult like behavior. Like they're
definitely.
approaching you as a group. We want to date you as a group. And we're also a political group. And so to me, that's a little too Jonestown.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the indicators of cult-like behavior is when things start getting sexual.
Exactly. I also tell people, since I've left, I've told people if they follow you on your way out, you were in a cult. Because people did follow me on my way out. Um,
Wow.
I asked too many questions and I was assaulted. When I left, people wanted explanations for why they said platforming specific people. Uh, they said I was platforming people that voted for Trump. Uh, yeah, I sometimes platform a guy whose third option was Trump, and
Okay.
he'll tell you that every time.
Yeah.
But that's at that point it is monitoring your behavior after you have left.
That's creepy.
Oh yeah. And to me, I'm just like, you people talk about land back and stuff, but now you're like questioning the lifestyle of an indigenous person, and I don't want to be bothered with it.
Right. So if we're thinking like 30% radical, and I'm sorry you were assaulted. I don't want to like probe on that if, you know.
Oh no, it's not a sensitive subject.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, if you want to tell that story, I'm sure people would like to hear it.
Yeah, so I experienced what I would consider stalking behavior that led to sexual assault. And so part of the reason why I was initially involved with just like the news side of it was because a lot of people were anonymous, and when everyone's anonymous, you can't tell who's out there. And so in my head, there were potentially the people that had sexually assaulted me could be anywhere out in the sea of people, because at some point they said 7,000 people gathered. There's no way people are checking stamps on the hand for 7,000 people. And so,
Wow.
yeah, so somebody approached me and said that they wanted to interview me, which I considered that to be threatening behavior because I was already on a news team. And so, if I wanted it to be on the news that I had been sexually assaulted within Antifa, I probably would have put it on the news myself, on the news team that I was already on.
Hmm.
And so, to me, people wanting to interview me, I was like, no, thank you. I don't need to get grilled on my experience. If I want to put it out there, I obviously have the channels for that. And no offense, but because it's Black Lives Matter, I would not want to be interviewed by a white woman. Um, and so there was some debate about that because apparently the person who had offered to interview me was of Syrian nationality, and I was just supposed to know that. Um,
Oh, yeah.
and so my
That's
response to
awkward.
that was, yeah, it was really awkward because to me, I was like, well, I don't really care. I'm indigenous. And so unless you have an indigenous person that's going to interview me, I am not going to take an interview. And so I'm already on a news team with a person that I would consider to be indigenous. So, like, my channel's already there. Uh,
So, so when you're saying news team, maybe I should have asked this at the beginning, but like, what was the organizational structure of this and like what constitutes being on a news team?
um, I would say that it's just like citizen journalism.
Okay.
Some people took themselves very seriously, and they needed the title journalist. And to me, I'm basically of the opinion that like anybody with a cell phone is really a journalist then,
Hmm.
because that's essentially what we were doing. We had like maybe 20 different people that would come out with their phones and film on a nightly basis.
Yeah.
And some of those people got more popular than others. And so they started investing in equipment, and they became kind of like Unicorn Riot.
Okay. So there's more I want to get into that, but I'm going to ask that after I ask this question. Um so when you're saying like 30% potentially radicalized, that reminds me of a an interview I did with a Hudson Institute senior fellow earlier on in this podcast, and I'll link that episode below for people who want to listen. But I kept asking him, like, what are we going to do about like this group of people who support terrorism now? Like, that's terrible in America. And he was saying, or like, because this was right when we were seeing all of these like pro Palestine rallies, like really even before Israel had struck back, right? And there were rallies
Yeah.
on October 8th to free Palestine when Israel had not yet responded, and we had seen all these terrible videos of massacres. And
Oh,
so,
yeah.
yeah,
That's when I said no.
really, that was your no.
That was my no. When October 7th happened,
Hmm.
as I was watching it, I hadn't yet formed an opinion on the Israel and Palestine thing. People had pressured me to come up with an opinion, And I just kept telling them, like, listen, I'm indigenous. My concerns are for people who are indigenous and people who are here right now.
Yep.
I'm not gonna get involved in your like Muslim versus Judaism thing.
Yeah.
And I'd appreciate it if that wasn't like part of the purity testing. And then October 7th happened, and I realized that I really couldn't stay out of having an opinion on it anymore. I couldn't remain neutral because, I mean, Israel experienced a terrorist attack, and I was watching
Right.
it in real time. And there was no other words that you can use for what was happening other than that straight up terrorism. And
Yeah.
so that's the point at which I decided that I side with Israel. Um, if it had happened to any other country, we would consider it a terrorist attack. But then October 8th happened. Next day, people started supporting Palestine. And that's when I said, absolutely no. Um, I've already chosen a side, but now I can see that one side is also inhumane because
Yeah.
Jewish people were not given time to grieve.
Yeah, they
And
had
I
to
think that's
immediately
absolutely,
start defending themselves. Yeah.
yeah, it's absolutely abhorrent that, you know, Israel suffers a terrorist attack. And instead of going up to your Jewish friends and asking them, because it's kind of like 9/11, like everybody knows somebody who was in the tower.
Mhm.
Uh, in the Jewish community, I feel like everybody knows somebody who is in Israel. And so
Mhm.
I feel like the appropriate response to October 7th would be to go up to your Jewish friends and ask them, are you okay right now? And nobody did that. Instead, they said, so, like we were saying, free Palestine, which
Yeah.
to me is absolutely abhorrent.
Yeah. Well, and then so I was asking this guy, I'm like, what does this mean? Like, how do we handle this? Because so many people like seem to like be very pro terrorism. And he was saying, oh, yeah, there's cells all over the United States, and they're not even recruiting Arabs anymore. Like, what these terrorist groups in the Middle East who would love nothing more than to attack us here at home in the United States or somewhere in Europe, they would love nothing more than to have a big, gigantic terrorist attack, October 7th style, 9/11 style here and like scare us here too and like kill us here too. And he was saying, like, what they're seeing when they're seeing these huge protests is like half the country is going to support us, the terrorists, after we do whatever we do. They're going to think that like they deserved it, which is
I sure
wild.
hope not.
I hope
I would
not.
love to think not.
Yeah. But he
I
was
would like to think
citing
that,
some of these, he was saying that they're recruiting within these groups, and then you said the same thing. So it
yeah, I
scares me.
definitely felt like people were trying to recruit me for terrorism. And I was like, that's not what I'm about. And it made me question how many other people silently were sitting in their anti Semitism, just not looking into it and listening to people and taking their word for it. Um, I had someone call me a Nazi because all I said was, I haven't formulated an opinion on that yet. And they told me Zionists are evil, they are the scum of the earth, they are evil colonizers. And at the time, I was like, well, I am an indigenous person. I have a couple friends that are Zionists. They have been nothing but supportive of me and like the struggle to get our land back.
Mhm.
So I can at least say that a handful of them are not crazy and evil. So I think that Zionism perhaps means different things to different people. And I was told, nope, it only means one thing, and it's colonialism and genocide. And I was called a Nazi, and I was called a white settler, a white supremacist, which is hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like,
Basically, these are people that put land back in their profile, and here they are calling a Native American a colonizer when they are guests in our home.
right. Well, it goes to show that those are all just truly buzzwords and they don't know the meaning of them. Because how are you going to
Exactly.
call an indigenous person a white settler colonialist? Like
Right.
that means something. Like being white means something. Being a settler and a colonialist means something. And if anyone who disagrees with you or any of those words, they're not interchangeable.
Absolutely. And so one of the most hilarious things that happened to me was on October 7th. I started posting, "This is terrible. Israel needs to defend itself." And so I started very intensely following the news, and I haven't really stopped posting about it since that happened. Um, right away, I had people that were like, "Are you crazy? Do you not understand what you're supporting?" And I was like, "Listen, you can probably think whatever you want about the war in general, but this specific, wars are made up of battles, and so this wasn't even a battle, it was a massacre. I think that we can say that massacres are bad." And
Mhm.
at some point, I actually had a preacher. Um, he went onto my Instagram and told me that I don't have a right to judge how people defend themselves. I told him, "I myself am a sexual assault survivor. I believe that I am well within my rights to draw a line at sexual assault. I don't think that it belongs anywhere
Yeah.
for any reason, no matter how oppressed you are." And he called me privileged. He called me an infiltrator, which I thought was an interesting word to pick, because what he's insinuating is that I have been pretending to be a leftist this whole time, and that I have just been trying to snitch on the movement, basically, which means, to me, means that he thinks that there is something there to hide.
Wow.
That was a Christian preacher who preaches liberation theology, is what he calls it.
And what would you call it?
I would call it terrorism apologia.
Yeah, I would agree with you. That's wild. I mean, that's
Yeah.
why it's like horseshoe theory, or I don't even, that maybe isn't what I would use to describe it, but it's like, I mean, these are people who say like sexual assault is wrong in all instances except when it's done to people we disagree with. Yeah.
So I thought it was hilarious that none of the feminists were there that day at work. Nobody punched in.
Well, right. Well, and it's like the hard thing with that, the second ideology where every like it's totally wrong except to do to people you disagree with, is they could start to disagree with you and then justify their behavior like that. And like that's why
Right.
the biggest reason I have a problem with like co-signing what Hamas did as like a legitimate form of resistance. It's like, okay, well then anyone can come up to me and claim in some way that I am oppressing them, which like I'm sorry, but like little baby Kafir Beebus did nothing to oppress the Palestinian people hiding in a shelter, hoping
Right.
like before he was dragged in with his brother and his mom into Gaza, and we still
And
don't know the condition of them, and like they did nothing to oppress the Palestinian people yet.
it's crazy to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
The I can understand people who say, like, I mean, I don't agree with them, but I can understand what they mean when people say that, "Oh, Israel is all colonizers and they don't belong there." But what, even if that was true, how does that justify taking a baby who hasn't
Right.
even spoken yet and can't agree with that rhetoric that you disagree with?
Right. Well, and then if it's okay, I also find it a little weird, and I want to say this carefully, but like the same people who are so concerned about the children of Gaza right now have not a concern in the world for babies like Kafir Beebis, or the baby that was beheaded, or the 40 babies that were killed on October 7th, or the baby in the womb that was cut out of its mother's belly, the baby that was born in captivity because I believe they kidnapped a pregnant woman. I mean, it,
Yeah.
if we're worried about innocent children, because there's like the thing with children is they're innocent, they didn't do anything to deserve this, why only care about one side's innocent children?
And then, like, where does that rhetoric take people? Um, because once people heard about all the children, they instantly started to deny that portion of it. And so people started saying, basically, pictures or it didn't happen,
Right, which is
which is crazy because they had GoPros.
right.
And so then they were trying to say these images are doctored, or the CIA created these images, or Israel themselves created these images. And then we start getting into things that are just explicitly anti feminism because, for example, people started questioning the raping of the women. They said that there was no evidence, we couldn't prove it, and so that stands against everything that feminists believe. I myself am a survivor, like I said, and I'm a childhood survivor as well as an adult survivor. And so
I'm so
when I
sorry.
went to court,
Yeah.
um, when I went to court, it had been so many years since the initial thing happened. So there was no test that they could do. They couldn't do a swab on me. They
Mhm.
couldn't do, they couldn't check my clothes or my body in any way. There was no physical evidence. All the physical evidence was gone. And they had to go through alternate means to figure out if it happened or not. And thankfully, they were able to determine that it did happen. But, these were questions that as a kid growing up were the type of things that deterred me from coming forward. Was like, nobody will believe me. People will say that I don't have any proof. People will blame me because I didn't save anything. And so it's not just anti-feminist, but clearly against children.
Yeah.
um,
Oh,
People don't understand that you have to apply the same logic to both peoples.
right.
They think we can just dehumanize them without dehumanizing each other. But no, what's going to happen is someone gets sexually assaulted again within the protest movement because you can't really manage all these people. It exists everywhere. It's going to happen here. And so what's going to end up happening is someone comes forward and they're going to have that same rhetoric put back in their face. They're going to be told pictures or it didn't happen. And so you've effectively removed feminism from protesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't have words. I don't have words because it's such a crazy, like, I can't believe we're here, you know?
Yeah, and they're shooting themselves in the foot
Yeah.
as well.
Well, and it's terrible for, like, the good causes that they're supporting. I mean, I'm not gonna co-sign everything that they're supporting, I obviously don't support Hezbollah, but, like, racial justice after a terrible situation, uh, that's a just cause, but if it's going to be corrupted by people who are like, "Actually, if you're not radicalized like us, we can essay you." Like, no, like, no, that's terrible. Like,
Right.
it's too bad that that's taken hold of that community. The last thing I want to ask you, you've speculated on this a little bit, and I have my own thoughts on this, but like, where do you think these groups are getting funding from?
So a lot of them started getting funding from uh, what they call mutual aid groups. They started calling everything mutual aid. It was hilarious. Um, People started putting like not GoFundMe but Cash Apps because it was less regulated. And so
Oh,
yeah, if if the government did want to take it all down, they could have just gone through the IRS, quite frankly, because these Cash App tags are all public and they're all over Twitter. So everyone's paranoia is pretty unfounded because they're not really covering their tracks. And so basically, people would make a Cash App tag, they would ask for donations, and then they would say how they were gonna, use the money. Some people were embezzling from these funds.
oh, I bet.
I'm sure you've heard, yeah, I'm sure you've heard about like the Black Lives Matter national chapter was embezzling funds. Well, we had that locally as well with people who told everyone that they were quite trustworthy.
Yeah.
Um, there were also people who were streaming started taking in donations. And so initially it starts out as like, I've been streaming all night. I've been out here for 6 hours filming this. I wish I had $5 to go buy something to eat. And so, people send you $20 so you can get some food. And then it just turns into every day you're getting a couple $100. And so if you want your money, you have to come out and stream. I had one woman on one of the little news teams that I was on. She told me that she wanted to quit her job so that she could do this full time, which at the time I laughed at her because to me, I was like, this thing's going to run out of steam at some point. And in her head, no, we could go on forever. Some people made a career out of it. Um, to me, it was ridiculous because, that's what we keep hearing on the news is these paid protesters. And so the last thing that I would want is to become paid.
Oh,
But we
yeah.
definitely we had some people who were homeless. And so they started out as like, I don't have a place to sleep right now. It would really help me if I had $300 for my cell phone bill or whatever. And then they just kind of make a lifestyle out of it. And now that's their job. Their job is protesting. That's all it takes for someone to start monetizing. And then we had, of course, the OnlyFans people.
Mm-hmm.
So, full disclosure, I used to be a cam girl. And
Okay.
so, I'm not sure, hopefully, the audience knows what that means.
I think that, yeah. I think people know what it means.
Okay. So, the, the one thing that I really didn't want when I started going to these protests, the last thing that I wanted was for anybody to say that I was just here to get follows for my job.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was a side gig, but the last thing I would want is for people to say, you only come here so that people will follow your page and give you money, right? Or to build your clientele.
Mm-hmm.
That's the last thing that I want people to say. But people started becoming popular, and then they started putting their OnlyFans out, and they had no problem with it. They had no problem with this being an advertising space. And to me, it's not an advertising space. I don't like to shit where I eat.
Yeah.
And so they're calling it a revolution. It's not a revolution if you're just coming here to pass out your business card.
Well, and isn't
We
it
had,
funny that they're communists and then they're trying to profit off of.
right. And so that's the other problem that I had with these kind of Cash App tag organizations. They called themselves mutual aid organizations. But really, what it was, it ended up being a co op. People pay into it and then they buy things in bulk and then they give them away to the people who are involved in that organization.
Yeah.
Some of them gave things away to like homeless people, and that was great. Um, but I can tell you that I personally put a lot more in than I got out of it. And the reason for that is that I asked too many questions. So I found myself outside of the network of service.
Oh, interesting. And then two places I can go with this. Right wing conspiracy is that big Democrat mega donors are donating and like proliferating this like protest movement, busing people places. Do you have any comment or like thoughts on that?
We definitely had a lot of like six-figure liberals that were donating to these mutual aid funds.
Okay.
Um, at some point, I came across like the snack wagon. We had like a food truck. It's changed names several times. I think the last name was Riot Kitchen. And so Riot Kitchen was a food truck. People would donate massive quantities of ribs and steak and meat. Um, they would donate coffee. They would donate all kinds of materials. And then on top of that, people were also donating cash. And so at some point, they had like $375,000,
Wow.
which is a lot of money
Yeah,
um, to be handled by like, a couple people in their 20s that have never worked at a 501c3 before.
totally.
But
Yeah.
the entire point to them, right? Like the entire point to them is like, well, we're not a 501c3 because we're going to be more grassroots than that. Um, but then you end up with the problem that they had where there were rumors that people were using one of the food trucks in the protest movement to launder money for a gang. And so I can definitely say that there was a strong gang presence at these protests.
Wow. Yeah. And if it's all Cash App tags, you'd have to think that they can trace that.
Right. Yeah, like I said, if the IRS really wanted to take it down, or if the government really wanted to take it down, they would just go onto Twitter, find all the Cash App tags, and report them to the IRS. It would be that easy. Because I can guarantee you nobody paid taxes on any of that. That's almost the point, because that's why you don't want to sign up for a 501c3, is because you want to be separate from the government, and separate from the government also means not paying any taxes on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because, like, from my understanding, C3s don't have to pay taxes, but I might be wrong about that.
Well, they're not really a 501c3.
Right.
They're really just co-ops,
Yeah.
except that they don't have a fixed membership. Is the difference between them and a co-op.
So, well, I mean, if anybody wants to make a little bit of money, if you report people to the IRS and they're found like that they did commit fraud, you get to keep like 50% of what they owe in taxes or something. So,
Oh wow,
if
I
yeah,
did not know that.
if you want to make a little bit of extra cash, I would go I would
No, yeah, the only reason why I care that they're not a real 501c3 is because I've seen lawyers talk about it on like Instagram, and they talk about how like you could be getting money from the government if you had a legitimate 501c3.
Oh, yeah,
Um, but of course, a lot of people just didn't want involvement from the government.
right. It's
Um,
hard when you're saying like it, an disorganized group of 20-year-olds who want to organize, like it kind of brings a buzzkill if you need to bring in the an accountant to set up a 501c3, you know?
right. And so we also had problems with people, once people started whispering about potential embezzlements, people started getting on board with the idea of we need to prove what we're spending it on. And so people would just like purchase things and take a picture of the receipt and upload it to prove that the money went where it's supposed to go.
Uh-huh.
However, they didn't take a picture or track any of um, the distribution of any of that. They're just tracking the purchase of the items. They're not tracking like we purchased 500 paper plates today. There's no record of who we gave those paper plates to.
Oh, yeah.
So basically, like I said, it ends up being more of a co-op than really any kind of charity, because people are paying into it and then they distribute.
Yeah. And then did you say something once about like you were wondering if like foreign governments might have been funding these things, like Qatar?
Yeah, so I read up on the involvement of Qatari money in the universities,
Yeah.
and so yeah, one of the, I mean, I guess it's more of like a spider sense. When I was in the protest movement itself, I just got the sense that something bigger is really in control here. And I don't know if it's because there was gang involvement, so maybe the bigger thing in control is the mafia, but you never know. It could potentially be a foreign government,
And they would be involved by like giving cash or like sending organizers or
or even just propping up the people who needed to be propped up.
okay. Because like that's kind of what has made it clear to me is like, you know, this is a group of people who came together over a common cause, and then some people would post about it and gain notoriety from it, so they became leaders. But that's very different than being elected a leader, where your intention is to go in and lead something versus you have a lot of notoriety, so people just kind of look to you, right?
Yeah, and I tried to explain to people. So people in this movement agree that racism exists everywhere
Mhm.
and everyone has the potential for it. And so for some reason, nobody ever thought, well, if we make an organization based off of just social criteria, we're going to end up propping people up that are white or white adjacent. And that's what ended up happening. Most of the people that became popular were white adjacent. And so we ended up having kind of a hilarious spectrum of representation.
Oh, funny. And then another thing that prioritizes is the people who have the time to devote because they're either trust fund babies or, don't really work, right?
Oh, absolutely. We had all kinds of scandals, but one of them was this girl that said that um she said that she needed money, and so she put out a request for mutual aid. And then it turns out that she was just going to buy shoes with it, and then uh, somebody leaked it that her parents are landlords, so she really didn't need our help at all. She could have just asked mom and dad as usual. Um, and then we had one kid who apparently his parents are producers, and that kid also rose. He was ascended to the top.
Oh,
I was one of the people that was working full time. I was actually working like 6/12s.
okay.
Um,
I don't know what that
and
means.
so, well, I was working like 12 hours a day, like at least
Oh,
6 times a week. Sometimes I would work every day a week
wow.
because of the occupation that I had at the time. Um, and so there was definitely like a mix of people. Some people you could see that they were going to work full time and then getting off and devoting every shred of their extra being to being there. And some people you could tell that they were just kind of like bored college kids who, after this is all done, will go on to be like yuppies
Yeah.
after they've had their summer of fun.
Yeah, definitely. Well, so this is a different episode than I've ever done, but I hope people kind of got a look at maybe a little bit of the inside of this movement that has been carrying out some of these maybe more disturbing protests, you know, like the the October 8th ones.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that every protest group is only as good as its parts. It's just the sum of all parts, and so uh, that's why it was so jarring to me that I didn't want to be associated with people who are supporting Hezbollah
Yeah.
or supporting Hamas or explicitly supporting the Taliban.
Yeah.
And I feel like I got out just in time because now they're no longer just supporting the ideas of these groups and saying that they are being misconstrued. They're now going all the way to calling them freedom fighter organizations. And it doesn't seem to matter anymore. Like, any criminal organization, we'll take any of them. Any terrorist org, we will take any of them. Houthis, we'll take those. Hamas, we'll take those. Taliban, everybody. Whereas before, it was more of Taliban, Hamas, and Hezbollah sympathizers. Now they are just vocally supporting it.
Wow. Well, be on the lookout, everyone. Thank you so much for doing this. The last question I want to ask you is, so the name of the podcast comes from my favorite Bible verse, which is the book of Nehemiah, chapter 6, verse 3. Basically, Nehemiah is building up the walls around Jerusalem because they're afraid of an attack. People are going to come overtake the kingdom of Judea, and they want to rebuild the second temple. And people come try to distract Nehemiah and say, like, try and get him to leave so that the wall won't be built so they can be invaded. And he tells them, like, I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop so that I can come down to you? So, like, if we're going to take anything from that story, like, what is your great work, like your thing that you're not going to stop doing, no matter if people try to distract you, anything like that? Like, what is so important to you that you're just going to scream it from the rooftops, I guess?
For me, I took a different approach to protesting than other people did
Mhm.
because I started getting involved with the Native American church.
Yeah.
And so I went to my first sweat, I went to my first ceremonies. And so while I was doing this protesting, I was also going through a period of like spiritual awakening.
Mm.
And I guess that's part of why I was so firm on what happened. And what I was hearing was I really was not willing to compromise my spiritual growth just to be surrounded by people who wanted violence. It's not that I disagree that violence is sometimes necessary. Um, I just believe that all life is sacred, and in our indigenous cultures, I believe that we are called on to attempt to avoid war at all costs.
Mhm.
And so, when people want me to go in the streets and fight Proud Boys, I decided to meet up with them instead and see if maybe we could find some common ground so that we don't end up killing each other.
Yeah. Well, that's a good one. Like having a conversation so we don't end up killing each other. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Well, I think let's wrap that up here. Thank you again so much, Selena. Um, I'll